My sister changed her attitude towards me after she discovered the secret of my past. Her cold gaze, hidden grievances, and hatred made me act quietly and methodically. I observed, endured, and planned until the tension in the house reached its limit.
Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us.
After my mother's funeral, the house stood quiet and almost wary, as if the walls themselves were waiting for someone to disturb this new order. The air smelled of dust, faded curtains, and frozen silence, and every step I took echoed dully. My sister and I hardly spoke. Everything came down to short glances, dry gestures, and endless little things that revealed our estrangement. She did everything deliberately slowly, avoiding the things I used. The first days after the funeral were thick like morning fog. It seemed we were just tired, but gradually something changed. I noticed her voice had become softer, her movements more careful, as if she was afraid to even stand next to me. A week later, when I came into the kitchen, she was standing by the table with an open box, holding an envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, and my name was written on top. She silently handed it to me, and at that moment I felt the world shrink to a few letters. Inside were documents typed on an old typewriter, stamped by an adoption agency. Everything looked official and final, like a decision that couldn't be appealed. She didn't say a word, just left the kitchen, leaving me alone among the smell of coffee and old wood. I stared at those papers for a long time, hoping to find at least one explanation, some hint that it was a mistake, but the papers were real. From that moment, everything in the house changed. Her footsteps became harder, doors closed with a soft click, and the air was filled with distrust. She stopped cooking, washing, the shared routines disappeared. Every morning I saw her wash her cup and hide it in the cupboard, as if she was afraid I might touch it. Even the smell of my shampoo in the bathroom suddenly began to irritate her, and I caught myself leaving the room when I heard her steps. Within a few days my clothes disappeared from the shared closet, then my toothbrush, then my towel. It all looked like an invisible cleansing, as if traces of an outsider were being erased from the house. I tried to find a moment to talk, but every word hung in the air, never reaching her. One evening I came home and found my shoes neatly placed by the door, next to a box labeled "Your Things." She was sitting in the living room with her phone in her hand and didn't even look in my direction. I realized that all this wasn't an emotional outburst but a cold, deliberate decision. The next day I received a letter addressed to my mother, but I opened it myself. It was a request from the bank to confirm the ownership shares of the house. Then I understood that everything was heading toward legally removing me. In the evening I tried to explain that I had never known the truth, that it was all new to me, but she stepped back as if my words physically touched her. There was no anger or pain on her face, only indifference bordering on contempt. After that there were no more conversations. We lived like neighbors, though even neighbors sometimes say hello. She didn't make a single movement without reason. Every morning I heard the refrigerator door, the sound of a spoon, and then silence. When I entered the kitchen, she was already gone, as if she calculated everything to the second. Sometimes I noticed how she looked at me from under her brow, evaluating, as if at a stranger who had moved in without permission. At night I couldn't sleep for a long time, listening to the creaking floorboards in the hallway, unable to tell whether she was walking or if it was my imagination. Once I heard the front door slam, looked out the window, and saw a car in the yard with the glow of a phone screen inside. She was talking to someone, long muffled with the same short intonations that now accompanied any encounter with me. After that, strange letters began to arrive, notices of unpaid bills, notifications about the revision of property shares. I realized she had gone further, trying to legally prove I had no rights to the house. My signature in old documents was questioned because, as it turned out, I wasn't a biological son. It all looked like a carefully planned operation. All I could do was wait for her to take the final step. The house no longer smelled of my mother, nothing remained to remind me of the past. With each passing day I felt the things around me becoming foreign. Even the floor beneath my feet felt different, cold, unfamiliar. I remembered how my mother loved this house, how she always said that walls absorb warmth if people live with kindness. Now the walls seemed empty, as if they had drained all that was human. Sometimes I tried to imagine what my mother would have said if she knew what was happening, but every attempt to mentally reach her brought only bitterness. I didn't know why she hid the truth. Maybe she was afraid it would destroy the family, or maybe she just didn't have time to tell. My sister seemed to see it as a betrayal, though I was only the result of someone else's decisions. Time passed slowly. Each minute dragged on like a day. I went out of my room less and less, ate whatever was left in the fridge, and caught myself thinking that even the sound of footsteps in the hallway had become threatening. At night I sat by the window, watching the dim streetlights outside and thinking how strange life is. Everything you thought was yours can crumble in a single evening because of a piece of paper. One of those nights I heard her lock her room door. That sound was the final point. Then I realized there was no place for me in the house anymore. I sat until dawn, listening to the creak of the beams and the dripping of the tap, and for the first time in many years, I felt that I had no family, no home, no past. Only a body breathing out of habit in a space where it was no longer wanted. I didn't pack my things right away, just sat, watching the morning light slowly seep through the window. The house was waking up, but no longer with me in it. Everything around looked foreign. Even the photographs on the walls where I was a child next to her seemed fake. In the window's reflection, I saw myself and didn't recognize who I was. Not because I had changed, but because I finally understood. For her, I had never existed. There once was a person who had been accepted into the family, but now only a mistake remained, one that needed to be corrected. When she left her room and passed by, the scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a reminder that she was alive while I no longer was, at least not in her understanding. And at that moment, I realized that even silence can be a weapon if a person knows how to use it. I decided to try again. After a week of silence, after every sound of her footsteps in the house had become an alarm signal for me, I tried to restore at least the illusion that we had once been close. In the evening, I went to the refrigerator, took out everything still edible, cut it, arranged it on plates, turned on the light so that the kitchen looked cozy, and even lit candles, although I had long forgotten the last time I did that. Everything looked strange, like a scene from someone else's life, not mine, but I wanted her to see it and maybe remember the past, what we had done together when our mother was still alive. She came home later than usual, the door creaked softly. I heard steps in the hallway as if she was slowly checking every corner, and when she entered the kitchen I froze. Her gaze slid past me, stopped at the set table, and nothing happened. She didn't say a word, didn't notice that I was standing nearby, as if my presence and preparation were invisible. Inside, a strange heat arose, but not anger, emptiness. I set another plate for myself, sat at the table, tried to observe her, but she silently walked to her room without stopping, without casting even a fleeting glance. I realized that my entire attempt at reconciliation had already failed, that the bridge I tried to build had been destroyed before I even approached. The night passed in dull silence, and every creak in the house sounded like a gunshot. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the water dripping from the tap, hearing the beams creak, and realized that now she had completely excluded me. In the morning, I didn't speak a word, went outside, and stood for a long time on the porch, looking at the empty yard where our childhood shadows had once run, recalling how our mother laughed on the veranda, and realizing that it was gone forever. I tried to convince myself that everything could be fixed, but a heaviness remained in my chest that no breakfast, no dinner, no attempt to prove I was still part of this family could wash away. Day after day, I watched her habits, how she moved through the house, rearranged the furniture, shuffled documents as if erasing my presence. Every object, every little thing became a weapon. I saw her remove my books from the shelves, rearrange photographs where we were children so that my face disappeared among the others. I understood that this was not mere anger. It was a cold, methodical strategy, and any move on my part would not change the outcome. I tried to think of my mother, remembered her words when she said that family is not just blood but also memory, but memory here no longer helped. It was being erased under the weight of her actions. One evening, when I again set dinner on the table, I saw her glance into the room for a few seconds, pause at the threshold, but her eyes were empty, showing no emotion, no sign of regret, only indifference. I realized that my efforts were noticed but meaningless. She had already made her decision, and nothing I did could change it. I felt a strange mixture of longing and anger, but the anger quickly gave way to exhaustion. I realized that all I could do was observe, live in a space where I was no longer wanted. The following days were like a dream. I walked through the house, pretended everything was fine, cooked, cleaned, and she pretended I didn't exist. I saw her talk on the phone, laugh, as if the past had been completely erased, as if no one had ever lived here with me. I tried to find an explanation in the documents where Mother wrote about my adoption, tried to understand why my sister reacted this way, But the more I searched for answers, the clearer it became that the truth no longer existed for me. Any word, any attempt at dialogue met with coldness, and I realized there were no more points of connection. Nights were long, and I sat by the window, watching the dim streetlights, thinking about how strangely the world is arranged. A family that seems reliable can, in a few days, turn into a cold space where every step is foreign and every glance a threat. I tried to remember childhood, when my sister and I hid under the blanket during storms, when mother read us fairy tales, but these memories no longer had power. They remained only inside me, in a soul where no one wanted to be near me anymore. I began to understand that any reconciliation is only possible when the other person is willing, and she was not. She had already made her choice, and my only path was to observe and adapt. Sometimes I caught myself thinking I should leave, at least temporarily, just to stop feeling her indifference every day. But at the same time, I couldn't allow myself to disappear without resistance, couldn't give up the space that had been part of my life, even if it had now become foreign. Everything around seemed to constrict, the walls of the house pressed on my chest, the air became dense, and every sound turned into an alarm. I tried to eat, cook, even joke to myself, but no attempt to restore the past made sense. A strange calm arose within me. If I cannot change her, cannot bring back the past, all that remains is to observe, live, and accept the cold she radiates. And at that moment, I realized that our connection had died, that the attempt at reconciliation had been the last action I could take, that from now on, only acceptance or quiet revenge if I found the strength. Night came again, and I sat in the kitchen, looking at the empty table, at the candles that no one else lit anymore, and thought that family is not what exists in the house, but what remains inside, and sometimes what remains inside is not enough. I couldn't endure this silence any longer. Every movement of hers, every step through the house sounded like a cold strike to my mind, and the emptiness around me pressed on my chest so tightly that it seemed impossible to breathe. In the evening I set everything I could find on the table, leftover food, prepared with a care that seemed strange even to me, turned on the light so that the kitchen looked familiar and comforting, like a reminder of the past, though my heart already knew the past couldn't be returned. When she entered, I stood nearby, watching her gaze slide past me, as if I didn't exist there, and then something long pent up flared inside me. I spoke quietly but firmly, each word measured, like a step along the edge of a cliff. That her indifference was tearing the house apart, that her silence made me a stranger in the room where I grew up, that I was tired of being invisible, that silence could not be her weapon, that the memory of our mother and childhood still lived in me, and I deserved it to be respected. She paused slightly, shoulders tensing, but her gaze remained cold, steady, empty, as if evaluating me as an object with no right to exist. I felt everything inside tense, and at the same time a strange relief appeared. At last I had said what I had held inside for months, what I had held for years, hiding pain, resentment, and loneliness. I saw her lips tighten, her fingers twitch, and in that tiny movement there was something new. For the first time in a long while, I felt that my words had reached their target. She didn't acknowledge them, but they affected her. I continued speaking, step by step, recalling how she rearranged my things, hid documents, did everything to make me feel alien, as if this house had never been ours, as if I could be erased from the space. She stood silently, but the silence was now different, tense like a taut string, and I realized that for the first time we faced the truth, even if she refused to accept it. I spoke of being tired of her indifference, that each day of her cold silence had been a blow slowly destroying my soul, and that I would no longer remain silent, that now every action of hers would meet my attention and my awareness, and this gave me a strange sense of power. She stepped back slightly, and at that moment I felt the tension reach its peak, that we could no longer ignore each other, that the air around us had become dense, like a wall that could not be passed silently. I sat, then stood, observing her, every gesture and movement, every breath, and understood that now everything was open, that our conflict was visible, and that hidden tension no longer existed. It had become part of reality, part of the house we shared. Inside me grew a sense of steadiness. I knew I could endure her coldness, her disregard could be seen and heard, and this gave a new strength I had never felt before. I remembered how Mother spoke of honesty and truth, and now I realized that for the first time we had spoken the truth to each other. Even if she didn't acknowledge it, the moment of truth had occurred. I saw her clench her hands, then unclench, as if trying to decide what to do with my disruption of the usual order, and I understood that now every movement of hers met my attention, my awareness, that I no longer vanished quietly, that now I could speak, and my words carried a weight they never had before. I felt no joy, no victory, only cold clarity and understanding that our connection was broken, but I could exist here, be part of the space she wanted to make foreign, and that gave a strange sense of control. The night lasted long. I sat by the window, watching the dim streetlight, listening to the wind, the floor creaking, the dripping water, and understood that now everything had changed. The conflict was open, and we could no longer live in the illusion of silent agreement. I thought of childhood, of mother's laughter on the veranda, of how my sister and I hid during storms, and realized that these memories had become my inner space, my support, while the outside reality was cold and ruthless. I recalled every moment we had been together, and each of these memories had now become both shield and weapon, because I no longer remained silent. I asserted myself and my right to be here. I heard her quietly moving in the room, heard her breathing, the floor creaking, but I was internally prepared for any of her moves, because for the first time in a long time I felt that I could stand and speak, that I could be visible, that I could exist even if she didn't want it. I thought about the future not as what would come, but as the fact that the rules of the game had changed, that I could act, observe, hear, and be heard, that silence was no longer a weapon, but a space in which I could assert myself. I sat until dawn, watching the light slowly change the rooms, shadows move across the walls, the world outside awaken, and understood that the inner tension had not disappeared, but had become part of my strength, part of my awareness, part of who I was here, in this house where my sister wanted to erase me but could not. I felt a strange combination of emptiness and strength, the understanding that the cold she radiated would not completely destroy me, that I could survive even as she ignored me, and this understanding became the beginning of a new stage that would determine everything to come, because now the open conflict had occurred, and my position inside the house had become real, tangible, visible, and unyielding. I began to act differently. After the confrontation, I realized silence would no longer be my weapon, but open aggression would achieve nothing either, so I moved quietly and methodically, watching her every step, every motion, every look she cast my way, and gradually I built my little psychological trap. In the first days, I simply recorded everything. When she entered rooms, how she set down cups, what words she used on phone calls, how she reacted to noise or smell, how she arranged things to emphasize my presence that she refused to acknowledge. Every petty detail became an instrument for future action, and with each passing day I saw her habitual confidence beginning to crack. I started with insignificant changes, carefully rearranging items she constantly moved, leaving small inconsistencies on the table in the room, on the shelves so that her accustomed order would be disturbed. She reacted barely noticeably, sometimes snorting, sometimes furrowing her brow slightly, but I could see her tensing inwardly. That was the beginning. Every step she took could now be part of my strategy. Then I added small details that weren't noticed at once but created psychological pressure. Notes with hints that threw her off, tiny objects left in paths where she set her bags, or I changed the order of groceries so she couldn't immediately find the familiar. Her reactions strengthened my resolve, because every tension, every irritated sigh, every twitch of a finger meant the plan worked. Sometimes I left things where they belonged as if nothing was happening and watched her begin to doubt herself. Am I really not seeing all this? Or did he do it on purpose? And in those doubts I felt my power. I didn't intervene openly, didn't utter a word, didn't try to accuse her. Everything was done quietly, invisibly, but each nervous gesture, each sigh, each glance showed she felt the pressure. I saw her check documents, her papers, her usual things over and over, not understanding that I already controlled every element of that space. Sometimes she tried to speak to me, but my answers were even cold, as if I didn't notice her attempts, and that made her even more irritated because the familiar game of control she relied on was breaking down. I saw her eyes widen, her jaw clench, her pace quicken as she checked a room, and I quietly watched and recorded every gesture to use later. Gradually her confidence in the house grew shaky, and I began to add more complex elements to the trap. I left important things so she would find them but not immediately. I changed the schedule of household little things so she couldn't predict habitual actions. I gently nudged her toward decisions that led to small mistakes, and I recorded those mistakes afterward, not to use them openly but simply for the inner sense of control. A feeling grew inside me that I was no longer merely observing, I was managing the space she considered hers. I understood that each of her reactions now worked in my favor, and that produced a tension that could not be hidden. Sometimes she shouted at me over trifles, sometimes she moved things sharply, but I didn't answer, didn't defend myself, simply let her play out her drama, and each emotional outburst was a signal to me. The strategy was working. A cold confidence grew inside me. She didn't see that her actions were predictable, that every movement was under my control, that her habits had become tools for my psychological revenge. I remembered how she used to laugh when we were children, how easily then she could manipulate my feelings, and now the sensation that I could do the same back, quietly and methodically, felt almost sweet. I began to mark her weaknesses, what she reacted to fastest, what made her nervous, what caused irritation, and I used that for small traps, creating the illusion of chaos around her while in reality everything was under my complete control. Each evening I checked the results. What changes had occurred, how she had reacted, where nervousness surfaced and where calm remained, and I built a new plan for the next day. The house became an arena of psychological games where I was an invisible observer, and at the same time the conductor, and she didn't understand she was playing by my rules. I watched her confidence crumble gradually, watched the neat order she was so proud of turn into a chaos she could not explain, and that gave me a sense of power and control. I didn't allow myself to feel joy openly. Everything remained cold, methodical, calculated. Each small thing, each gesture, every mistake of my sister was part of the strategy, not chance. Sometimes I recalled my mother and her words that strength lies in observation and patience, and I understood that these very qualities allowed me to be invisible yet completely manage the situation, and that feeling was almost satisfaction. So the days went on. Every morning, every evening, every movement around the house became part of the game whose single goal was to make my sister feel, quietly at first, that her indifference and cold no longer ruled me, that control and strategy were now in my hands, and that each of her steps had become predictable and manageable, producing the long-awaited sensation of revenge, quiet, cold, but precise and methodical. I noticed how her confidence gradually melted with each of my actions, with every quiet alteration of the order she considered hers, and that feeling grew inside me, cold and precise like an icy knife. I did not rush, did not press openly, but every little thing, every movement of mine created an atmosphere around her in which she lost her habitual control. I watched her begin to doubt, check things twice, turn around more often than necessary, as if expecting a trick that wasn't there except for my quiet presence. Sometimes I left papers on the table, carefully shifted objects, sometimes allowed chance to create a bit of chaos, but all of it was part of the strategy. She nervously pressed her lips together, stumbled over her own steps, talked to herself, and I simply watched and recorded every detail, every trembling gesture, because I understood we were close to the moment when her accustomed authority would finally collapse. I saw her become angry, not directly at me, but at the whole house, at the space that had once seemed hers. Every scream, every sigh, every sharp reaction of hers confirmed to me that the strategy worked, and that the tension had reached a critical point. One evening I left things so that she would stumble upon an important document she had been searching for but could not find, and that became the last straw. She lunged for it, grabbed it, papers fell everywhere, and I sat quietly nearby watching her face flush with irritation and helplessness. I watched her make sudden gestures with her hands, saw her eyes narrow, her lips pressed together, and I understood she was close to the limit. I remained silent, but every motion of mine, every minute of waiting increased the internal pressure. She shouted, threw things, tried to find someone to blame, but in the end she realized that all of this had happened in silence, and that she herself was losing control of the situation. I did not intervene, did not calm her, did not offer help. Everything unfolded naturally as a consequence of her own emotional exhaustion. The night was long, the tension mounted, and at some point I realized she had fully recognized her helplessness, and then what I had long expected happened. She packed her things without saying a word, her eyes full of anger, hurt, and fear, and I simply watched as she took the first step toward the door, finally crossed the threshold and left. In that moment I felt a strange relief, and at the same time a cold emptiness. Victory had been achieved, but the price was high. We had lost the shared bond that had once been our home. I was left alone in the silence where every sound seemed amplified, every detail meaningful, and I understood that now this was my space, but it bore the shadow of her departure. The days after she left were filled with a strange mix of freedom and emptiness. I could arrange the house as I wished, but the sense of her presence remained, and every sound, every creak of the floor reminded me of what had happened. I recalled her face, her tension, her hands trembling nervously when she tried to control the house, and understood that all of this was the result of my actions, a quiet strategy, the psychological pressure I had built over months. I did not feel joy, there was no triumph, only the understanding that strength and control had been achieved, that the emotional and psychological game was over, and that now I could breathe calmly in a house where the rules were set by me, and she had chosen to leave on her own, freeing the space. I remembered moments from our childhood, how she laughed, how we argued and fought over small things, and I understood that everything had changed. No step of hers could affect me anymore, no action of hers would return the control I had quietly and methodically constructed. Inside me a sense of power grew, but along with it came an understanding of responsibility for what had happened, for the emptiness she left, for the silence that now filled the rooms. I saw how every corner of the house, every detail she had considered hers, was now subject to my strategy, and that feeling was at once satisfaction and a cold reality I would have to accept. My sister had gone, and that decision became the final point of her authority. But for me a new chapter opened. The realization that control over space and psychological strength were things she could not take from me, and that now the time had come when I could live by my own rules, feel my position and inner independence, while remembering that all of this had been achieved through a cold, methodical game, through observation, patience, and the precise use of her emotions against her. After she left, the house emptied to such an extent that the silence felt almost tangible, pressing on every cell of my body, and reminding me that victory does not always bring joy. I walked through the rooms, touched the objects that had once been symbols of her presence, and felt a strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. Every corner, every shelf, every sound of the creaking floor now obeyed me, but instead of satisfaction, a cold, heavy feeling grew inside. I had gained power but lost a part of myself with her departure. I remembered childhood, how we laughed, argued, shared little things, how we sometimes got upset and immediately forgave each other. All of that now seemed distant, almost unreal. I could calmly look at the books on the shelves, the cups on the tables, the things she had left untouched, and I understood that no one else controlled me. But at the same time, I understood that no one would recreate the living sense of presence in this house. I sat on the sofa and closed my eyes, hearing the wind outside the window softly rustling the leaves of the trees, and in that noise it seemed I heard her voice, her laughter, her irritated sighs, and each remembered sound struck the heart like a cold blade. I realized that the revenge had been precise and measured, that every little trick of mine, every small manipulation had led to her leaving, but an inner voice reminded me that the price had been too high. I thought that the loss of human connection, even after all the offenses and cold words, leaves a void that no victory can fill. I remembered how she used to look at me, a mixture of indifference and hidden resentment, and understood that her gaze had now disappeared from my life forever. At times it seemed to me that she might return, that there was still a chance to hear her steps behind the door or to see a familiar face, but that was an illusion, and each realization of the finality of her departure hit harder. I recalled moments from our childhood, how she defended me, how together we fought for small victories, how her laughter and irritation gave life to the house. And now all of this was destroyed, erased by my own hands, and the victory felt both sweet and bitter at once. I understood that a power had grown inside me, the ability to control a situation, to influence another person's behavior, to see the consequences of my actions, but this power came with the realization that human bonds are not restored through a cold strategy. I noticed how the windows reflected empty rooms, how there was no trace of her on the walls, how the floor creaked softly under my steps, and realized that this space was now completely mine, but it carried the weight of the past I myself had created. I tried to justify my actions. The revenge was deserved, she earned it. Her coldness and indifference deserved to be met with consequences, but every justification felt cold and insufficient because the inner emptiness reminded me of the price I had paid along with her. I remembered her tears, her screams, her hands trembling from tension as I observed her reactions, and I understood that all of it was part of a story we could no longer change. Sometimes I caught myself thinking I could hear her voice beyond the door, that she would return to argue or laugh again, but each time reality harshly reminded me that it was impossible. Inside me grew a strange feeling that the strength and control I had achieved were the price of loneliness, that every victory leaves scars invisible to others, but felt sharply when you are left alone with the silence. I thought about the future, how to plan my days now, what decisions to make, how to live in a space that had become entirely mine but lacked the living presence of the person with whom I once had a bond. I understood that I could arrange everything as I pleased, set rules, change the familiar order, create new rituals, but the inner emptiness would remind me of all that was lost. I felt a strange relief that I could breathe freely in a house where no one controlled me, but at the same time, I realized that control and strategy would not replace the human closeness that had gone with my sister. In the evenings, I sat in the silence, recalled her face, her gestures, her habits, and understood that all of this had become part of a past that could not be returned, and that my actions, though they had led to victory, had left deep wounds in my soul. I thought about the price of revenge, how it shapes inner strength, how it destroys the remnants of trust, how it leaves a void felt especially sharply in moments of silence and solitude. I understood that now I could live by my own rules, control space and situations, but I could not bring back the warmth, the sense of life we once shared, and that victory always leaves consequences that stay with you forever. I sat late into the night, listened to the wind rustling the leaves outside the windows, to the dark rooms reflecting emptiness, and understood that the revenge was complete. But the cost of carrying it out was loneliness, memories, and a cold reality I would have to live with. I had been the victor in a cold game, but at the same time I had lost what truly mattered: human connection, trust, and a piece of family we had lost forever. And in that understanding, in that realization, in that strange mixture of strength and emptiness, I remained alone, watching the house that had become mine, but which would never be the same as before.